There's a quiet moment that happens when you disappear, not dramatically, not angrily, but calmly. It's the moment where the noise fades and something uncomfortable begins to echo in her mind. Stay with me, because near the end of this video, I'll explain why that silence affects her far more than any argument ever could. And if this kind of psychological clarity helps you make sense of your experiences, gently tap like and subscribe so this channel can keep reaching the men who need it. I want to begin by clearing a misunderstanding many men carry. Disappearing is not about punishment, it's not about manipulation, and it's certainly not about trying to make someone suffer. When done in a healthy way, disappearing is simply the act of removing your presence when it is no longer valued, respected, or reciprocated. And that single act often reveals truths a woman does not fully face while you are still there, still available, still explaining yourself. The first brutal truth she realizes is this: your presence was stabilizing her more than she admitted. While you were there, consistent, attentive, emotionally grounded, you became a quiet reference point, not entertainment, not excitement, stability. And stability is often invisible until it's gone. When you disappear, the emotional ground shifts. Conversations feel different. Days feel less anchored. She may not immediately label it as missing you, but she feels the imbalance. The second truth is harder. She realizes you were giving more than she was returning. When you're present, your effort can normalize imbalance. You answer texts quickly, you initiate, you listen, you smooth over tension. But once you step away, the emotional labor you were carrying becomes obvious. Silence exposes asymmetry, and that realization often arrives with discomfort, not clarity. The third truth is subtle, but powerful. She realizes you had boundaries she underestimated. Many women assume a good man will always stay, always adapt, always explain. When you disappear without drama, it challenges that assumption. It forces a reassessment. Maybe you weren't weak for being kind. Maybe you were strong enough to walk away quietly. The fourth truth is internal. She realizes how much of her sense of importance came from your attention. This is not about ego in a shallow sense. Attention validates, it reassures. When it's gone, there's a psychological gap, and into that gap comes reflection, sometimes regret. The fifth truth is this: she cannot control the narrative anymore. While you were present, she could define the dynamic. Your absence removes that control. There's no conversation to steer, no reaction to predict. That uncertainty can be deeply unsettling. The sixth truth begins to surface slowly. She realizes you weren't trying to win her, you were choosing her, and choice carries weight. When someone chooses you freely and then chooses themselves instead, it reframes the entire relationship. By the time these realizations begin to settle, something important has already happened within you. You stopped proving, you stopped persuading, you stopped negotiating your worth. And whether she ever reaches out or not, that internal shift matters more than any response she could give. Because disappearance, when done with dignity, doesn't make you invisible. It makes your value undeniable. After the initial shock of your absence settles, a deeper layer of realization begins to form. And this is where regret often quietly starts to grow. Not because she suddenly lost you, but because she begins to understand what kind of man you were in ways she didn't fully grasp while you were present. The seventh truth she confronts is this: emotional safety is rare, and she may not have protected it. Many women mistake emotional safety for something that will always be there. A man who listens without judgment, who doesn't escalate conflict, who stays grounded instead of reactive. This can feel ordinary when it's consistent. But once it's gone, comparisons begin. New conversations feel thinner, new connections feel louder but less steady. And slowly, she realizes that what she lost wasn't intensity, it was peace. The eighth truth is uncomfortable because it challenges self-image. She realizes that some of her behavior went unexamined because you were patient. When a man absorbs tension without exploding, it can unintentionally delay accountability. Your disappearance removes that buffer. There's no calm presence to soften sharp moments, no reassurance to neutralize doubt. In that space, self-reflection becomes unavoidable. Not dramatic guilt, but quiet awareness. The ninth truth arrives last. and it's the heaviest. She realizes that your absence didn't break you, it clarified you. Often, women assume that if a man pulls away, it's because he couldn't handle emotional depth, commitment, or complexity. But when you disappear and do not chase, do not explain endlessly, do not reappear emotionally fractured, that story collapses. What replaces it is far more unsettling. Maybe you left because you knew your worth. This realization reframes everything. Past conversations replay differently. Moments she dismissed as nice begin to look like strength. Your restraint reads as self-respect. Your silence reads as clarity, not weakness. And here's where many men misunderstand regret. Regret is not always loud. It doesn't always result in messages, apologies, or attempts to reconnect. Often, it shows up as comparison, as hesitation, as a subtle awareness that something meaningful was mishandled. But I want to shift the focus back to you, because this video is not about waiting for her regret. It's about understanding why disappearance changes dynamics and how it changes you. When you step away without hostility, you teach yourself a crucial lesson. Your value is not dependent on being chosen repeatedly by the same person. That realization strengthens emotional self-trust. You begin to recognize when effort is mutual and when it is one-sided. You stop confusing attachment with connection. This is why disappearance feels so different from abandonment. You are not leaving to create fear. You are leaving to preserve alignment. And that distinction matters psychologically. Some women, when faced with this shift, will grow. Others will not. But either way, the dynamic can never return to what it was. Because once a man demonstrates that he can walk away peacefully, the illusion of endless availability disappears. And that is often what lingers in her mind. Not anger, not resentment, but the understanding that she encountered a man who didn't need to be convinced to stay and didn't need to be chased to leave. And for many women, that realization comes too late. Not because you disappeared, but because you finally stood still within yourself. There is another layer most people never talk about, the internal recalibration that happens after you disappear. This is not about her missing texts or routines. It's about how absence forces meaning to surface where comfort once lived. One of the most difficult truths she encounters is realizing that availability had masked your depth. While you were present, your consistency made your character easy to overlook. Reliability can be mistaken for simplicity. Emotional steadiness can be mistaken for lack of complexity. But when you disappear, she is left only with memory, and memory has a way of sharpening details that routine blurred. She starts remembering how you responded under pressure, how you listened without needing to dominate, how you didn't rush to control outcomes. And that contrast becomes clearer only when you are no longer there to demonstrate it daily. Another realization follows closely. Attraction is not sustained by reassurance alone. Many women believe that emotional connection grows from constant affirmation. But when you disappear without hostility, she learns something counterintuitive, that attraction is also built on self-containment. The man who can step back without collapsing emotionally forces a reevaluation of desire. Because neediness repels, but self-possession quietly commands respect. And respect often deepens attraction long after availability fades. Then comes a more unsettling truth. She realizes that your silence is not empty. Silence after emotional maturity is not confusion. It's resolution. There's no mixed signal to analyze, no emotional chaos to decode. That clarity can be deeply unsettling because it leaves no room to reinterpret the past in a way that preserves comfort. Your absence feels final, not because you vanished, but because you left nothing unresolved inside yourself. At this stage, comparison begins, not consciously at first. New conversations feel louder, more performative. New connections may offer attention, but not attunement. She notices how often she has to explain herself now, how often she feels misunderstood, how quickly interactions escalate or collapse. And slowly, she realizes something difficult to admit. Emotional intelligence is rare, and she encountered it without fully recognizing its value. Another truth emerges quietly. She realizes that you did not disappear to escape intimacy. You disappeared because intimacy without reciprocity becomes self-betrayal. That reframing is important. It dismantles the narrative that you are afraid, overwhelmed, or incapable. Instead, it places responsibility where it belongs, on alignment. For you, something equally important is happening beneath the surface. Disappearing recalibrates your internal compass. You begin to notice how often you once explained yourself to be understood, how often you tolerated uncertainty to preserve connection. Distance clarifies patterns that closeness obscures. You see where your energy flowed without return, and once seen, that awareness cannot be undone. This is why reconnection, if it ever happens, never feels the same. Because the man who disappeared is not the man who stayed too long. You are no longer negotiating for space. You are protecting it. You no longer chase clarity. You require it. And whether she senses this consciously or not, the dynamic has shifted permanently. What many men fail to understand is that disappearance is not powerful because it creates longing. It's powerful because it creates contrast. It separates emotional maturity from emotional noise. It exposes the difference between attention and presence, between connection and convenience. And once that contrast is felt, it cannot be unfelt, not by her and not by you. This is the quiet power of stepping away with dignity, not to be missed, but to be remembered accurately. And that memory, for many women, becomes heavier with time, not because you were perfect, but because you were real, grounded, and no longer available to be taken for granted. As time passes, the emotional landscape shifts again, less reactive, more reflective. This is where understanding deepens, not through emotion, but through meaning. And meaning has weight. One of the most confronting truths she eventually recognizes is that consistency is a form of leadership. While you were present, your steadiness quietly guided the emotional rhythm of the connection. You didn't dominate it. You didn't control it. You simply set a tone, calm, grounded, intentional. When you disappeared, that tone vanished with you. And without it, emotional interactions may begin to feel chaotic or directionless. This is often when she realizes that leadership doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it's only noticed in its absence. Another realization follows. Emotional freedom does not feel the way she expected. Many people believe freedom comes from having fewer expectations placed on them. But when you disappear, the freedom to act without consequence can feel hollow. There is no longer a man whose respect quietly mattered, whose opinion carried emotional weight. And in that space, freedom can begin to feel less like relief and more like isolation. Not because she is alone, but because she is no longer seen in the same way. She may also begin to recognize how rare it was to be met without competition. A man who doesn't posture, who doesn't try to impress, who doesn't treat connection like a performance. That kind of presence creates safety. When it's gone, interactions can feel transactional, more strategic, less sincere, and comparison, again, does its quiet work. There is another difficult truth that surfaces slowly. You did not disappear because she failed. You disappeared because you refused to abandon yourself. This distinction matters. It removes blame and replaces it with clarity. It becomes harder to frame the ending as something you couldn't handle. Instead, it begins to look like a boundary reached its limit. For you, this stage is where emotional authority begins to solidify. You stop romanticizing potential. You start valuing patterns. You understand that consistency without reciprocity is not devotion. It's self-erasure. And that understanding reshapes how you move forward, not just in relationships, but in how you relate to yourself. Some women, at this point, feel the urge to reconnect, not from manipulation, but from curiosity. Not to reclaim you, but to understand you. Because your disappearance created a question that lingers. What does a man look like when he is emotionally whole and still willing to walk away? But here is the truth most men miss. Whether she reaches out or not is no longer the measure of success. The success is that you no longer confuse effort with value. You no longer over-explain to be chosen. You no longer stay where your presence is optional. Disappearing taught you something profound. Attraction that requires self-abandonment is not attraction, it's attachment. And attachment without mutual care eventually becomes resentment. This is why, if reconnection happens, it often feels different. Not colder, but clearer. You are no longer hoping to be understood. You are observing whether understanding exists. You are no longer offering unlimited access. You are offering alignment. And she feels that difference immediately, not as distance, but as gravity. Because a man who knows when to step back carries a weight that cannot be negotiated. In the end, what she regrets is not losing you. It's realizing that she encountered a man who showed her what emotional integrity looks like. And that lesson arrived only after the teacher was gone. And for you, that realization marks a turning point, not toward bitterness, but toward self-respect that no longer asks for permission. At this point, what she feels is no longer about anger or longing. It's about clarity. The absence of your presence forces reflection in ways that proximity never could. And that reflection often lands harder than any argument, fight, or disappointment ever did. One of the hardest truths she begins to see is how much she took for granted, not in a cruel sense, but in the way people often overlook quiet value. Your attention, patience, and grounded energy may have seemed ordinary when they were constant. But once they vanish, she realizes that ordinary was actually rare. That consistency, emotional steadiness, and reliability were gifts she didn't fully recognize until they were gone. Another truth emerges. The freedom to be herself wasn't just about doing what she wanted. It was about being met where she was, without needing to perform, without needing to manipulate. When you are present, it can feel like safety is endless. But once you disappear, she sees that the freedom you offered was not casual. It required responsibility on both sides. And in that responsibility, she now notices her own compromises, her own patterns of testing or pushing boundaries she didn't understand she had crossed. She also comes to understand the power of non-reaction. While you were present, your calmness may have felt like passivity, but your absence proves otherwise. You didn't argue, you didn't chase, you didn't explain endlessly, and that quiet non-reaction, your emotional self-possession, becomes a mirror. She sees how she responded to a man who wouldn't bend to her doubts or fears, and that mirror is often unsettling. Another realization is about timing. She understands, maybe too late, that you left not out of impatience, but because emotional growth has a limit when it is one-sided. Relationships are not built on endurance alone. They are built on mutual recognition. When one person gives endlessly while the other only takes, the imbalance is subtle but corrosive. Disappearance exposes that imbalance in a way nothing else can. And slowly, she realizes that your absence is teaching her lessons she ignored while you were present. The subtle power of a man who values himself is revealed not in conflict, but in his quiet detachment. It is a presence felt in memory, in comparison, in reflection. And that awareness often grows into regret, not always loud, not always conscious, but persistent, lingering, and undeniable. For you, this stage is transformative. Walking away without hostility, without drama, reinforces boundaries and strengthens self-worth. You no longer confuse attention with love, availability with commitment, or effort with respect. You start seeing connections clearly, not through hope, but through alignment. And that clarity is something she may sense, even if she doesn't consciously articulate it, because emotional intelligence carries an invisible weight. Her regret, when it comes, is never about control. It's about awareness. It's about seeing that she encountered a man who modeled what maturity, consistency, and self-respect look like, and that model is no longer accessible. And in that, she begins to understand a truth many men never realize. You are not missed for what you gave in the moment. You are missed for the standard you set and the boundaries you maintained. Because when a man disappears gracefully, he does more than leave a void. He leaves a mirror of what real presence looks like, and sometimes that mirror is heavier than any loss. Finally, we reach the part that ties everything together, the truth that resonates long after your absence. By now, she has processed layers of reflection, comparison, and subtle regret. And the last, heaviest realization often hits quietly, without fanfare. She recognizes that she lost not just a man, but the version of herself that existed when she felt fully aligned with someone of integrity. She realizes that your presence wasn't just about companionship, it was about perspective. You held a mirror to her own patterns, behaviors, and choices, often without saying a word. When you disappeared, that mirror remained, but it reflected her alone. Suddenly, the moments she once dismissed as ordinary or routine begin to feel significant. Your patience, your calmness, your ability to listen without judgment, these were not conveniences. They were rare expressions of respect and care, and she notices their absence like a missing weight in her daily life. Another truth crystallizes. She cannot replicate the value you offered elsewhere. She may find attention, excitement, or even admiration, but she cannot find the emotional steadiness you embodied. That combination of calm, reliability, and self-respect is uncommon, and it becomes painfully apparent once it is gone. And because it cannot be duplicated, regret begins to simmer quietly. It may never result in a call or message, it may never even be spoken, but it lingers, reshaping how she evaluates relationships moving forward. She also realizes that her assumptions about control were flawed. While you were present, she may have assumed she had influence over your choices, that your devotion was infinite, or that your patience could be stretched endlessly. When you disappear, she sees that influence was never as complete as she imagined. You had boundaries, and those boundaries defined your freedom. That freedom, your ability to walk away without chaos or hostility, is something she may respect internally more than she admits outwardly. Perhaps the most profound realization is this: she experiences a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in her internal gravity. Your absence reframes her expectations, her judgments, and her understanding of connection. She begins to recognize what it truly means to be with a man who values himself, who does not settle for imbalance, and who walks away when respect and reciprocity are missing. That understanding is often bitter, sometimes unsettling, but impossible to ignore. For you, this moment is not about revenge, nor validation, nor proof of worth. It is about awareness. Disappearing with dignity teaches you that emotional investment must be mutual. It teaches that your presence is powerful, not when it is demanded, but when it is given freely and received with respect. It teaches that walking away is not failure, it is preservation of self, and in that, you model a quiet strength that no amount of drama could achieve. The truth is simple, yet heavy. Some women only fully grasp the value of a man once he is gone. And when that realization lands, it often brings regret, not just for lost time, but for the missed opportunity to engage with a presence that was rare, grounded, and emotionally mature. And that, in the quietest yet most profound way, is why your disappearance can leave a lasting mark. Not because you chased her away, not because you were distant, but because you finally stopped proving your worth and instead allowed your absence to reveal it naturally. Her regret becomes a silent acknowledgement, and your strength becomes an unspoken truth that endures long after the goodbye.